Hello, witches, wizards, and muggles. Today I'm going to show you how to crochet your very own Weasley sweater. Let's get started. Let's go over our materials. For this sweater, you're going to need two different colors of yarn. You're going to need one color that is for the main body, and then another color that is for the letter. Now I'm using Heartland yarn by Lion Brand again. This sweater is a variation of my coziest sweater ever pattern, which also uses the same Heartland yarn by Lion Brand. This video is not sponsored, but again, hey Lion Brand, if you're watching, hit me up. So this yarn is a medium number 4 weight yarn, and it calls for a 6mm crochet hook. So as long as you can find a yarn that's medium or calls for a number 6 crochet hook, you'll have a yarn that's about the same as mine. You're going to need multiple skeins of this yarn, but the amount of yarn you need will depend on the size of the person that this sweater is for. So if this is for an adult who is very large, then you're going to need a lot more yarn than this. If it's for a 4-year-old who is very small, then you really won't need that much yarn. Now, whatever yarn you're using, for the letter and for the main body, they need to be the same type of yarn. The reason is because as we're changing yarn colors, you're going to want to make sure that the yarns are the same size and weight. And by keeping it within the same brand and type of yarn, you have a greater chance of them being a match versus if you were to go with two different varieties of yarn. You want it to be a seamless transition, so to speak. So the only indicator that you changed yarns is that the color of the yarn has changed as opposed to the weight of the yarn. Next, you're going to need a Tunisian crochet hook. This Tunisian crochet hook is a 6mm crochet hook, which is the size that my yarn recommends. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Tunisian crochet, I'll put some links down in the description to some tutorials for basics about Tunisian crochet. The next hook that we're going to need is optional. So for the sweater as featured in the movie, there is no ribbing or any kind of finishing at the ends. It's just kind of like unfinished ends that curl a little bit. If you don't want that, if you want kind of finished ends and you want to add some ribbing, then you're going to need another crochet hook to make the ribbing. So I'm using this size G 4mm crochet hook. I find that ribbing usually looks a little bit better when you do it with a hook that is slightly smaller than the yarn recommends. So again, my yarn recommends a 6mm crochet hook, and we're going to be using a 4mm crochet hook for the ribbing, and we'll make some ribbing together. But again, this is optional. The last thing you're going to need is a tapestry needle. This is because we're doing a lot of color changes in this pattern and you're going to need to weave in the ends. But that is everything we need to make this sweater. The first thing we need to do is figure out our sizing. And in order to do that, we need to take a couple measurements. We need a measurement from your neck down to your wrist, from the top of your shoulder down to your waist, across the waist. If you're measuring your body directly, then just measure around your waist and divide that measurement by 2 because we're going to be working this in a front panel and a back panel. We'll also need to measure armhole depth, which is the area where your sleeve attaches to the sweater, and your wrist circumference. You also need to measure neck hole depth. As you can see, I'm getting these measurements by measuring a garment that I know already fits the person I'm making this sweater for. However, there are other resources you can use. If you're making this sweater for someone else and you're unable to measure them directly, you can go onto the Craft Yarn Council's website. They have some standard measurements for various sizes that you can use as the measurements for the sweater you're making. I've left a link to the exact page in the description. Here is a list of those measurements for your reference. You can also find them in the written pattern. The link to that is down in the description. All right, so now that we have everything measured, next thing we need to do is make our gauge so that we can calculate how many rows and how many stitches across everything needs to be to get the measurements that we want. The next thing we need to do in order to calculate how many rows long and how many stitches wide our sweater is going to be is we need to make a gauge. A gauge is just a 10 by 10 swatch of the stitch that you're using so that you can measure how tall and how wide a 10 by 10 stitch swatch is. So for this tutorial, I'm assuming you already know how to crochet, but for those of you who are new, I've left links down in the description to different tutorials that you can use to get an in-depth explanation of all the stitches that we're going to be using to make this sweater. For this tutorial, I'm just kind of going to give you a brief overview of how each stitch works, and then assume that you know how to crochet from there. If you need more help, you can check out the links down in the description. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is chain 10. Okay, so now we have 10 chains. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Tunisian crochet, the difference between Tunisian crochet and regular crochet is that instead of pulling up a loop on our hook, and then yarning over and pulling through to crochet, we are actually going to pull up a loop in every chain across. So this first loop on our hook counts as our first chain. So we're going to go into the second chain from the hook and pull up a loop. So now we have 2. And then we're going to go into the third chain from the hook and pull up another loop. We have 3. And we're going to do that in every chain all the way across. So we should have 10 loops on our hook by the time this is all done. Okay, so now I have 10 loops on my hook. Next, we're going to do our return pass. So we're going to pull through the row. So the first thing we need to do is yarn over and pull through 1 loop. And then from here on out, we're going to yarn over and pull through 2 loops. So we're going to yarn over, pull through 1, 2. Yarn over, pull through 2. Yarn over, pull through 2. So we're just going to yarn over and pull through 2 all the way until the end of our row. Okay, so we're back at the beginning. That's our Tunisian foundation row. This counts as the first row. Next, we're going to complete this gauge using Tunisian knit stitch. So to do Tunisian knit stitch, you go through the center of each loop. So for Tunisian crochet, the first loop on your hook always counts as the first stitch. So you're always starting in the second stitch from the hook. Here are all of my stitches. We are going to go through this second stitch from the hook. We're going to go directly through the middle. And again, if this is unclear, you can always go check out those links down in the description to more in-depth tutorials about how Tunisian crochet works. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through every single stitch, right through the middle of it, and pull up a loop, just like we did for our foundation row. So you just go through and pull up a loop. And then the very last stitch, instead of just going through like this, instead of going through like this, you'll see that there's kind of 2 loops like that. We're going to go through it so that these 2 loops are on the side. That way it gives us just kind of a nice finish. If you don't manage to do it exactly like that, then no problem. It's not going to be a big deal, but it just gives it a nicer finish at the end. So you pull through like that. And then just like we did before, we're going to yarn over, pull through 1, and then yarn over and pull through 2 for every remaining stitch, or for every remaining loop. And that's our first row of Tunisian knit stitch. Now we have 2 rows. And now we're just going to repeat what we just did for this previous row for every remaining row. So we need 10 rows of this. So I'm going to go through just like I did before, pull up a loop in every single stitch across. And then do my return pass. And we're going to do this until we have 10 rows. So this is the 3rd row. So I need to make 7 more rows. And then we'll have a complete gauge. So I will meet you back here when that's all done. Okay, so I've come to the end of my 10th row and I'm just going to chain 1 to finish off. You don't need to bind off this row. Now, in order to show you how to kind of measure this, I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to stick some skewers through here. You don't need to do this. This is purely so that I can show you, how I'm measuring it, just so that I don't have all this curling happening. So yeah, I've got that just to kind of help flatten it out so that I can show you the measurements. You need to measure across. And again, you can round up to the nearest centimeter too. It doesn't have to be perfect. So this one doesn't actually make a perfect square, but it's close enough, So that's like 7.5 centimeters. So I'm going to round that up to 8 just to make my life easier. Yeah, it's going to be a little wider, but it doesn't matter all that much. If this were like woodworking or sewing, if we were cutting something out for a sewing pattern, I would be a lot more strict about this. But for crochet, I'm not as strict about it because, you know, it's okay if your sweater's a little bit big. And then down here, this is also just over 7.5 centimeters. So this one was just right around 7.5 centimeters. And this one is just over 7.5 centimeters. So it's not a perfect square, but it's damn near close. So that's why I'm just rounding up to 8 centimeters and calling it good, because that makes my life easier and I am lazy as Here it is. I got my gauge. So the next thing we need to do is we need to use this and this to calculate how many rows tall and how many stitches across this is going to be. The way that you do this, and I will leave these formulas down in the description. You don't have to memorize it here. It will also be in the written pattern. The link to the written pattern for this is also down in the description. So you're not completely on your own here. I will leave all of that vital information in places where they're easily accessible. But let's go over it together. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to calculate how many stitches wide this is going to be. So we need to divide our sweater width by our gauge width. So 34 divided by 8. Sweater width divided by gauge width. 34 divided by 8 gives us 4.25 equals 4.25. And then we're going to take this 4.25 and multiply it by 10 because that's how many stitches across our gauge was. So our gauge is 10 stitches by 10 rows. Yeah, 10 stitches by 10 rows. So we're going to take this and we're going to multiply it by 10, right? And that gives us 42.5 stitches. And you know, 42.5, you can't have half a stitch. So we're going to do the squiggly line and round that up to 43. Because again, better too big than too small. And then that way my 4-year-old can wear it for more than 1 year in a row. So yeah, that gives me 43 stitches. Yay. Now let's calculate our rows. So the way to calculate your rows is pretty much identical. So we're going to take our sweater height and our gauge height. So in this case, that's 37 divided by 8 equals 4.625. And we're going to multiply that by 10. Again, because that's how many rows were in our gauge. And that gives us, and I'm just going to forget the 5 there because, you know, who wants to forget that? So that gives us 46.2 rows. Again, you can't have a partial row. So we're going to round that up to the nearest whole number, which gives us 47 rows. All right, so now we know how many stitches wide and how many rows tall our front and back panel need to be. Let's make the back panel. We're going to do the back panel first to give you an idea. The front panel, we'll do front and back panel, are both just big rectangles. Like that. But the front will have your letter on there. Right? And I'll show you how to do the letter later. But because the front and the back panel are the same and they're just a big rectangle, we're going to start with the back panel first because that's the easier panel. And then we're going to move on to the front panel, which is the part that has our letter. We're going to start with the back panel. And the first thing we need to do is chain the number of stitches in a row. So in my case, my rows have 43 stitches. So I'm going to chain 43. And you are going to chain however many stitches you calculated. 1, 2, 3. 43. All right, so now that I have my chain row done, we are going to do our foundation row. So we are going to pull up 1 loop in every chain. So for me, I'm going to pull up 43 loops, 1 in every chain across, just like we did for our gauge. Okay, so now I have 43 stitches, and for those of you who are new to Tunisian crochet, this is why we have this kind of long cord on the back, is because it kind of falls off the hook a little bit. So now that I have my 43 loops on my hook, I'm going to go and do my return pass. So everything about this is exactly the same way we did it in our gauge. Hopefully that was enough to get you familiarized with it. I'm going to yarn over, pull through the first loop, then yarn over and pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through 2 until I reach the end of my row. So I've reached the end of my row and I've got my foundation row down. And now we're going to do the remaining rows for this entire back panel in Tunisian knit stitch. So just like we did for our gauge, we're going to go through the center of our loops, like diagonal towards the back, and just pull up a loop through every stitch for our Tunisian knit stitch. Just like we did for our gauge. Okay, so I've reached the end of my row and I'm going to yarn over, pull through 1, and then yarn over and pull through 2 until I reach the end of my row. Okay, so now I'm at the end of my row and we'll do one more row together and then I'll just kind of leave you to it. So just like with the previous row, we're going to go through and pull up 1 loop for every stitch. Okay, so I've reached the end of my row and now I'm going to do my return pass. I'm going to yarn over and pull through 1 and then yarn over and pull through 2 for all of the remaining loops on my hook. Okay, so I've reached the end of my row and this is where I'm going to leave you to it. For this back panel, it's pretty simple. You just do the entire thing in rows of Tunisian knit stitch. So in my case, I'm going to keep going until I have 47 rows. So just keep on doing rows of Tunisian knit stitch until you reach the number of rows that you calculated earlier. And I will meet you back here when that's all done. Okay, so now I've reached the end of my row and now we're going to bind off the top row. To do that, we're just going to chain 1 and we're going to just do a single crochet in every stitch across the top. So basically you just go through the stitch like you're going to do a knit stitch again and you pull up a loop. But this time we're just going to yarn over and single crochet 1. So we're going to go all the way across into every stitch and just single crochet 1 in every stitch across to bind off the ends. Okay, so I've reached the end of my row and everything's all bound off. So now I can chain 1 to finish off and cut my yarn. So this is what it looks like. It's just a rectangle, nothing special. All right, and so the front panel is pretty much the exact same pattern, except we're going to do some color changes to help us make the letter. So let's make the front panel. Okay, so in order to make the front panel, we need to figure out where and when we need to start our color changes. So the first thing that we're going to go over is kind of dividing this up into different portions. This is my panel, basically. And to calculate where our letter is going to be, basically you want your letter to be right in the center towards the top. Divide your width by 3. So in my case, my panels were 43 stitches wide and 47 rows tall. That's important. So I want to divide this by 3. So 43 divided by 3 doesn't work out so well. But the most important thing is that the shoulders, so if I divide this into thirds, these shoulders need to have the exact same number of stitches. So if something doesn't divide perfectly into 3, let the shoulders be even. And then whatever's left over can be in this center section. So in my case, 43 does not divide so well. The closest number that can be divided by 3 is 42, which is 14. So basically what I would do here is it would be 14 stitches over here, 14 stitches over here, and then I have 15 here. Because 14 times 3 is 42, but I have 43 stitches, so I need that. I'm just putting that extra stitch right here. This is how wide my letter is going to be. My letter is going to be a maximum of 15 stitches wide. Now we're ready to draft our letter. So what you'll need is you'll either need some graph paper. You can use physical graph paper. So in my case, I'm actually going to be using an iPad instead of physical graph paper because I have an iPad with some graph paper loaded up in it. I will have this graph paper image thing on the website with my written pattern so that you can just download it if you want to try and do it on your phone, like in your notes app and stuff. This shouldn't be too hard to do digitally if you don't want to go out and buy physical graph paper. There's a couple things you can do. You can either go and print off a letter, or you can just draw something. So in my case, like let's say you wanted to draw something. First, you need to mark off how many stitches wide your pattern needs to be. So in my case, it's 15 stitches. So let me just mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. There we go. Now I know where my letter needs to start. You can just write out a letter if you want. So like, let's say I wanted to start up here and say like, definitely not perfect. I'm going to go and fill in every single square. So, you just do it like this. So you can draw out your letter and then you can go in and kind of fill in your squares accordingly or mark off your squares. And then let's say if you want it to be a little bit more robust or something like that, you can always just go in and kind of play with it until it looks a little bit better. So that's option 1. Just hand draw a letter and then fill in the squares or mark off the squares on your physical graph paper until you have something that resembles the letter that you want. So that's option 1. So the next option would be if you have either a printer. I know not everybody has a printer anymore. I don't have a printer anymore. Or if you're using an iPad or some sort of tablet like I am, write the letter that you want, in whatever font you want. Most of the resources available say that these Weasley sweaters in the movie are done with Times New Roman font if you want to be very authentic with it. So in this case, I'm going to go Times New Roman bold. And then you can just go through and manipulate the size until it is as large as you need it or as wide as you need it to be. And so then once you have your letter kind of there, you can just fill in your graph paper accordingly. It's not going to be perfect. Remember, this is basically turning it into pixel art. So this is a little thinner than I would like. So I'm actually going to kind of beef it up a little bit, but not so beefy that it's bold. Just go through and fill in the squares. Again, this is pixel art, so it is going to require a little bit of finesse to kind of get it right. Especially for letters like M, which is just a big old pain in the ass. So just kind of mess around with it. You can fill in squares randomly, color things in, and see how it looks. And then once you have something that you like and that suits you, then you can move on. So this works whether you're doing it digitally or doing it with just graph paper and a pencil. This is also good for if you wanted to use this sweater pattern to do other kind of images. So let's say you want to put like a Christmas tree or something on there instead of a letter. You could do that pretty much using the same technique. Pretty much just use your Minecraft skills to draft your letter. And that's what we got. So now to figure out where the letter goes, we need to figure out kind of where we want to put it. And basically, that's the halfway mark. Like that. There we go. Into quarters, sorry, and into thirds. So if you divide the length into quarters and the width into thirds, this is where my letter will be. Slightly above middle, perfectly in the center. That's where you want it to be. So basically, it's the height divided by 4 and then the width. But it's not going to divide perfectly into 4, and it's not going to fit perfectly into the quarter. So the one that we need to care about the most is this portion right here. So this is where our letter is pretty much going to end, right? And the starting position will be determined by how many rows long your letter is. So in my case, my letter was 13 rows long. So that's 13 rows is my letter. So first thing that we need to do is we are actually going to divide the number of rows we have by 4 to figure out kind of how many rows we have above our letter. So in my case, 47 divided by 4 is 11 point something, something, something. So I'm going to round that up. So in that case, 12. Yeah, so there's going to be 12 rows in between the end of my letter and the top of the panel. And then I know that my letter is 13 rows. So that's 13 rows. And then all of this is whatever the hell is left over, even though this is the part we're going to do first. So 13 plus 12 is 25, and I've got 47 rows. So that means this is going to be 22 rows. So I'm going to crochet 22 rows. Then I'm going to do my letter, and then I'm going to crochet 12 rows. I know that was a little bit complex. That was probably more complex than you were hoping for. But again, this is trying to crochet a letter onto a shirt. And there's 26 different effing letters to choose from and a million different sizes that your sweater could be. So yeah, there is a little bit of math involved, but you know what? You're probably all adults. And I'm guessing that you're reasonably intelligent adults as well. Hopefully this made sense. I'll leave a detailed description of how to do this in the written pattern. The link to the written pattern can be found in the description. So if you need a little bit more guidance or you just want to kind of read over it again, go check out that written pattern because that's going to probably really help you with this. Now that we know kind of how this is going to go, you can start crocheting the front panel. And just like the back panel, we are going to be crocheting it from the bottom up, which means that we need to crochet this section first. So in my case, I'm going to do 22 rows of knit stitch, and then we'll do the letter. We need to start with our main body color of yarn. So I'm going to go through and do my foundation row, just like I did with the back panel. The number of stitches does not change between the front and the back panel. So mine is still 43 stitches wide and 47 rows tall. I just have something special happening in the middle of it, that's all. So just like you did with the back panel, go through and chain as many stitches as you're going to have. Okay, so I've got my 43 chains. And now, just like we did before, I am going to go through and pull up one loop in every chain all the way across the row. So this isn't new for you. This is the exact same as it was with the back panel. Just go through and pull up one loop in every chain. Okay, and then once you have one loop pulled up in every chain, go ahead and do your return pass. Okay. And then once you reach the end of your row, we are going to do our remaining rows in the bottom part, doing Tunisian knit stitch. So you're just going to go through and do rows of Tunisian knit stitch until you are ready to start your letter. So in my case, I'm going to keep going until I have 22 rows. For you, that's going to be different. So just look at whatever number you calculated for this bottom part and do knit stitch until you are ready to start doing your letter. And I will meet you back here when we're ready to do that. Okay, so I've reached the end of my 22 rows, and now I am ready to start on the letter portion. Earlier, we calculated that each of my shoulders is 14 stitches, and then the middle letter portion is going to be 15 stitches. So the first thing I need to do for the first row of the letter is pull up 14 loops in my regular color. Okay, so I've got 14 loops, and now I am ready to begin with my letter. So I need to change yarn colors. Now for this, depending on the letter you're doing, you'll probably want more than one ball of yarn going. So what I did was I just took some from my main skein of yarn and just made a ball, because as you're changing colors, you know, I've got these two posts right here for the sides of the M, right? And there's a considerable gap between them that's going to be really hard to bridge if I just keep my yarn connected. And I don't want to have a million different ends to weave in. So the way that you get around having to cut the yarn and then restart is you have two separate balls of yarn going, one on this side and one on this side. And then once we get up here, we'll have a third ball of yarn going. So, you know, you've kind of got this divided into three main sections. My rule of thumb is if there's a 3 or more stitch gap in between, you know, the color changes, then I'm actually going to have a separate ball of yarn working next section. So I'm going to have one ball of yarn working this section, one for this section, and then once I get up here, one for the middle section. I'll show you what I mean by that, but just to give you an overview, that's kind of how this has to work. So now that I've got my 14 stitches, I need to change to the letter color. And the way that we do that in Tunisian crochet, there's several different ways to change colors, but I'm going to show you the kind of the way that I prefer for something like this over something like a Russian join. This one, what you do is you really just go through your loop like you normally would. And then instead of pulling up with your main body color, you pull up with your new color. Just like that. And then what you can do is you can kind of take your strands like this. I've got this strand and I'm actually going to cross it over and kind of lock it into place. So it's kind of, they're crossed like that in the back. This just helps keep them in place and keeps the loops from coming out for now. And then we'll weave in these yarn tails later. Now I've got my main body color on this side and I've got my letter color on this side. So now I've got two separate balls of yarn working. And then if I look at my pattern, I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches for this first portion. So I'm going to pull up 5 loops of my new color. I've already got 1. Here's 2, 3, 4, and 5. Just like that. And now I need to switch back to my main body color, but I've got quite a gap here, so I'm actually going to start a second skein of my main body color. So now I'm ready to change back to my main color, and I'm going to go through the next loop just like I did, and I'm going to pull through with my new color. And then I'm going to do just like I did before, and I'm going to take these strands and just twist them over to kind of lock it into place. And then what I'm also going to do is just mark off the ones that I've done. So I've done this one, this one, this one, here, just like this. And now I need to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of my main body color. Okay, so I've got 1 and I need 6 of this. So there's 1, and then the next one, here's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now I'm ready to change back to my letter color, and I'm going to start a new ball with this as well. And I'm just going to go through and pull it up, and then twist it together to lock everything into place. According to my pattern, I need, so I've done this, 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 this. I need 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches in my letter color. So I've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now I'm ready to switch back to my main body. So I need to get another skein of yarn. And I know this is a, this is definitely a pain, but it is so worth it. So this is definitely like a trust the process kind of situation. So trust the process here. And now I'm back onto the shoulders. I'm off the letter portion and back onto the shoulders. Yep. So I'm just going to finish to the end of the row in my main body color. So I've reached the end of my row, and now we're going to do our return pass. And our return pass also involves changing back to your kind of alternating colors. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So now I'm going to do my return pass, and I'm going to yarn over and pull through 1, and then yarn over and pull through 2, all the way until I get to kind of close to my color change. But yes, I'm going to yarn over, pull through 1, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, all the way until I get to my color change. So for those of you looking at this and being like, hey, you've got a lot more stitches than I thought you had, that is because I filmed this at a later point in the process, but it helps illustrate it just a little bit better at this point. At this point, I have 1 loop of my main body color remaining on my hook. whenever I am changing from my main body color to my letter color, I do it when there is only one loop of the main body color on my hook. However, when I am changing back from my letter color to my main body color, I do it when there's two loops of my letter color on my hook. Now the reason is because when we yarn over and pull through two loops, we've got this kind of section right here, that kind of connector between one stitch and the next stitch. And we want that connector to be the appropriate color. So that little post or that little connector right here is always going to be the main body color. So I've got two loops of my letter color remaining on my hook. So I'm going to change back to my letter color and pull through the remaining two loops. And this loop on our hook right here, this first loop, that is going to be that connector piece. So if I yarn over and pull through two again, you can see this little connector piece right there. Now, if I were to do it with my letter color yarn, let me just undo this, go back and undo this. Let's say I were to do this with my letter color yarn. I yarn over and pull through two and then switch to my body color yarn like this. Now I've got this kind of extra little post that's jutting out from the side of the letter like that. That's not what we want. We want this part that's jutting out. We only want this clean vertical line to be the letter. So that's why we're doing it this way. So every time you're changing from the body to the letter, you do it when there is one loop of your body color remaining on your hook. Every time you are changing from the letter color back to the body, you do it when there is two loops of your letter color on your hook. So yarn over, pull through two, and it creates that really clean transition. So now I'm going to yarn over and pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, yeah. So when I'm changing to my letter color from my main body color, I do it at a time when there's only one loop of my main body color remaining on the hook. So now I'm going to grab the yarn from the skein that is for this one, twist it over, and yarn over and pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two. And now I have two loops of my letter color remaining on my hook. So I'm going to change back to my main body color and then yarn over and pull through these two loops. So remember, when you're changing from your main body color to your letter color, you do it when there is only one loop of your main body color remaining on your hook. When you're changing from your letter color back to your main body color, you do it at a time when there are two loops of your letter color remaining on your hook. And now I'm ready to complete the rest of my row. So I'm going to yarn over and pull through two until I reach the end of my row. Now, before I continue on with the remaining rows, I actually want to weave in these loose tails because I don't like to have a ton of tails hanging out. I do want to have, only the tails that are essential for completing this sweater. So the ones that are still connected to the skein, I'm going to keep, but the rest of them I am going to weave in so that they're not in the way. Okay, so now this is what it's looking like. I've got all of my strands of yarn kind of neatly coming off the back. I've got all my ends weaved in, and now all I have to worry about is these. So now we're ready to move on to the next row. So I've got this row complete. Now I'm ready to move on to the next row. So just like before, I'm going to do my 14 stitches of my main body color, but as you can see here, I have one extra stitch. I'm going to do 15 stitches of my main body color, followed by 3 stitches of my letter color. I'm going to do my 14 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 13, 14. So I've got 14 here. But if I look at my pattern right here, I have this one extra stitch of my main body color. So I'm going to do one more stitch of my main body color, and then I'm going to switch to my sweater color, or to my letter color, and do 3 stitches of my letter color. So I've got one more stitch here that I need to work. So going into the next stitch. There we go. And now I'm ready to change back to my letter color. So I'm flipping it over to lock it into place. And then I'm going to do 3 stitches of my letter color. 1, 2, 3. Just like that. And then I need to switch back to my body color. Now, if I look on the back, my main body color is actually like 1 stitch over. It's okay. I can, hop over like 1 or 2 stitches, no problem. So yeah, I'm going to put my hook through here, and then I'm just going to pull this one through, like this, and just kind of pull it over like that. It's no big deal. And then I'm going to do 8 of this one. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And now I'm ready to switch back to my letter color. So I'm going to twist it over to lock it into place. And I need to do 2 of this one according to my pattern. So here's 1 and 2. And now I need to switch back to my main body color. So I'm going to pick from here. And so now I need to finish my row in my main body color. All right, so now we're ready to do our return pass. So I'm going to yarn over, pull through 1, then yarn over, pull through 2, pull through 2, pull through 2, 2, 2, 2, and now I have 1 loop of my main body color on my hook. So now we're going to change back to the letter color. And this one, it's going to be a pretty short transition. So I'm going to yarn over, pull through 2, and now I've got 2 loops of my letter color remaining on my hook. So now I'm going to transition back to my body color. And then yarn over, pull through 2. And then keep going until I'm ready to transition again. And I've got 1 loop of my main body color remaining on my hook. So I'm going to change back to my letter color. Yarn over, pull through 2. Yarn over, pull through 2. And now I've got 2 loops of my letter color remaining on my hook. So I'm going to change back to my main body color and complete the row. Okay, now I've reached the end of my row. I'm going to leave you to it. I'm going to continue to film this, and I'll just have this be in fast motion so that you can see my letter as it starts to form. But pretty much the only instruction for this part was how to transition back and forth between your color changes and when to do it. Because everybody's letter is different, the exact point when you need to do it is going to be different. And I will leave you to it, and I will keep filming and show you what I'm doing, and you can kind of watch. And yeah, and then if you have any questions, make sure you leave it in the comments below, and I'll try my best to answer them. Okay, so I've got my letter all complete with all the ends in the back weaved in. Not the prettiest thing from the back, but good enough. It stretches well, it does everything, and it's completely weaved in. It's not done via a duplicate stitch or anything like that. But yeah, there we go. So now I need to consult my book. Where did I put my book? Over here. So now looking at this, consulting my thing, the last thing I need to do is my 12 rows of the main body color, and then I'll be all done. So go ahead and crochet your remaining rows. Yep, so now I am completely done with all my color changes. I'm just going to go through and crochet my remaining rows. Just working in a basic Tunisian knit stitch, no color changes, just all the way across in our main body color. All right, yeah, so just go through and do the rest of your rows until you reach the end, and I will meet you back here when that's all done. Okay, so I've reached the end of my 12 rows, and now once you're all done, you can just go ahead and do one row of single crochets across to bind it, just like we did with the back panel. Okay, and then once you reach the end of your binding row, you can just chain one to finish off, and that is it. That's our front panel all done. Okay, so now we're ready to join the front panel and the back panel. And what we need to do first is get our measurement for our neck opening. Yeah, so my neck opening measured 17 centimeters, and this is 34 centimeters across. So that means half of it is going to be the neck opening. So since half of it's going to be the neck opening, I know that I've got 43 stitches across. So 43 stitches doesn't really divide evenly. That gives me 22 stitches to divide up against the shoulders, and then 21 stitches in the middle. So what I'll do is I'll mark off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And match them up together, and then I'll use like a stitch marker or a pin or something to pin those together. And so once you've got it all marked off, you can go ahead and secure it all together. I just like to secure everything together using a just single crochet. So I just go through all the stitches and single crochet them together. Yeah, so you could do that. You could slip stitch them all together. You could use your tapestry needles, sew them together. So whatever technique you prefer, just attach them at the shoulders. That's as complex as it needs to be for those of you who are like, but how? Just however you want. Just get yourself from A to B. Attach the shoulders. So I'm going through the single crochet on the front and then the back panel, pulling my yarn through both panels and then single crocheting to attach them together. All right, and so this is what it looks like from the outside at the shoulder seams. All right, and now we can also seam the sides. All right, so to seam the sides, we need to take our measurement for the armhole. So for me, that's 16 centimeters. And I'm just going to measure from the shoulder seam, which right there, down 16 centimeters. I'm just going to mark that place with a stitch marker and then count. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And then I'll count the same on the other side. So I've got 15 on this side, so I need to count down 15 rows on this side, and that should give me my arm opening. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And then mark that off. And that gives us our arm opening. And then same thing on the other side with the same number of stitches. So here I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And then down the other side. And now you can seam the sides using the same technique that you used for the shoulders, all the way up to the stitch markers, leaving the armholes open. Okay, so once you have the sides all seamed, then we can start working on the sleeves. And to do the sleeves, you already know how many stitches are going to be in your armhole. So now we need to figure out how many rows we need and how many increases we need to do to get from the beginning of the sleeve to your armhole stitch count. So returning to our handy dandy notebook, my sleeve was 10 centimeters in width, but that's only for half of it because remember that it goes all the way around. So really it's going to be 20 centimeters in width. Let's go over here. So we've got like our sleeve, like this, right? But that's only half of it because you've got like the other half over here too. This part for me was 10 centimeters, but for the entire thing, it's actually 20. So we already know that this one is going to be 30 stitches. So we don't need to calculate this one, but we need to calculate how many stitches are going to be over here. So according to my gauge, 10 stitches wide is 8 centimeters. So we need to go 20 divided by 8 times 10. 20 divided by 8 is the width that we need divided by our gauge width, and then times 10 is the number of stitches in our gauge. So 20 divided by 8 is 2.5 times 10 equals 25. So I've got 25 stitches at the beginning, and then I need to get up to 30 stitches. It was at this point that I realized I'd already recorded how to calculate the sleeve measurement and the increase pattern in my coziest sweater ever video. So instead of re-recording it in this video, I'm just going to insert the footage from that video. Enjoy. The first thing we need to do is measure the shoulder of our sweater. So get your sweater and measure from the edge of the neck all the way to the edge of the armhole. Now we're ready to calculate how long our sleeve needs to be. Now, the reason why we're doing it like this is because your shoulder for your sweater doesn't fall exactly on top of where your natural shoulder ends. It usually goes down a little bit over your shoulder. So taking a measurement just from the top of our shoulder to our wrist would mean that we have sleeves that are just a little bit too long for us. To calculate the sleeve length, we need to subtract our shoulder measurement from our neck to wrist measurement that we took earlier. This will tell us how long our sleeve needs to be. To give you an example, my neck to wrist measurement was 63 centimeters, and my shoulder measurement was 24 centimeters. So 63 minus 24 equals 39, and I'm going to round that up to 40 just to make my life easier. So my sleeve length is 40 centimeters. Next, we need to calculate how many rows it's going to take in order to reach our desired measurement. The reason why we're doing this is because we are going to have a couple of increase rows in this sleeve pattern, and we need to figure out how many rows we have to work with before we can calculate how frequently we do our increase rounds. Now let's calculate how many rows we're going to have. All you need to do is take the sleeve length divided by the gauge length times 10, which is the number of rows in your gauge. In my case, my sleeve length was 40 centimeters and my gauge length was 8 centimeters. 40 divided by 8 is 5. Then 5 times 10 is 50, for a total of 50 rows. Next, we need to calculate our increases. My armhole was 54 stitches wide, and my sleeve opening was 40 stitches wide. That means there's a 14 stitch difference between the wrist and the armhole. So because there's a 14-inch difference between the wrist and the armhole, that means I need to increase 14 times. In this pattern, each increase row contains 2 increases. So 14 divided by 2 is 7. That means I need 7 increase rows. If you come up with an odd number of increase rows, that's okay. You can just have one final increase row that only has a single increase in it. It's not going to throw off the shape too much. Now, if I need 50 rows in order to reach my desired arm length, that means I need to figure out how to space out 7 increase rows among those 50 rows for my arm length. The way to do that is to divide the number of rows in your arm length by the number of increase rows you're going to have. So in my case, I need 50 rows for my arm length, and I have 7 increase rows. 50 divided by 7 is 7 point something. If you come out with a decimal point, which you probably will, just take the whole number and forget the decimal point. So in my case, that would be every 7 rows is an increase row, and the point something is just going to be a row without an increase. So if every 7th row is an increase, that means the pattern is 6 regular non-increase rows with just 1 single crochet all the way across, followed by an increase row, and then repeating until I have 50 rows. All right, so now that we've calculated our increase pattern, we can go ahead and start making the sleeves. So my sleeve has 25 stitches at the base, so I'm going to chain 25. 1, 2, 3, 23, 24, 25. Now I'm going to go back across. I'm going to pull up 1 loop in every chain so that I have 25 loops on my hook. 1, 2, 3. And then once you reach the end of your row, go ahead and do your return pass. Okay. And now we're going to start our knit stitches, and you're going to do as many rows as you calculated when you were calculating your increase pattern. So in my case, I have 3 increase rows because I need to get up to 30 stitches. So my increases are going to happen every 13 rounds. So I'm going to go ahead and crochet another 11 rows because this plus this would be 12. And then my 13th row is going to be my increase row. So just go ahead and do your non-increase rows, whatever your pattern is. So in my case, it's 12 regular rows, just a Tunisian knit stitch all the way across, and 1 row with increases. So I'm going to do my 12 non-increase rows, and then I'll meet you back here when I'm ready to do my increase row. All right, so I've finished my 12 rows, and now I'm ready to do my first increase row. So to do an increase, the way that our increase rows are going to work is you're going to increase in the first space and in the space before the second to last chain. So the increases are going to be at the very ends of the row. So what we're going to do is before we go through this second stitch right here, we're going to do an increase. And the way we do an increase is we just pull up a loop in the space between stitches. So just like this. So there you go. You've got your loop. And that is your increase. It's as easy as that. And then you go through and you do the rest of your row as normal until you get to the last stitch. And right before the last stitch, we're going to do another increase. All right, so here I am at my last, this is my last stitch right here. And right before we do this last stitch, we're going to put our hook through the space between the stitches and pull up a loop to do our second increase and then finish off the row. And that's it. That's as easy as doing increases is. So now we're going to do our return pass as normal. So we're going to yarn over and pull through 1, then yarn over and pull through 2 for every remaining loop on the hook until we get to the end of our row. And that's it. That's as easy as increasing is. You just pull up a loop in the space between stitches. And now you have an increase. So go ahead and do your remaining increase rows. In my case, I have two more increase rows I got to do. So in my case, I'm going to do 12 rows of regular knit stitch followed by an increase row, and then another 12 rows followed by an increase row. Your increase pattern is going to be a little bit different than mine. So just go along following the increase pattern that you calculated earlier, and I will meet you back here when the sleeve is ready to be seamed. Okay, so once you finish binding off your row, you can go ahead and chain 1, but we're not going to cut the yarn to finish off. We're actually going to fold this in half. We've got our sweater, we've got the bottom right here, which is the shorter side and then the longer side. So we're going to fold this in half and seam the sleeve. Just fold it in half like that. And then just like we did for the shoulders and the sides of the sweater, we're going to go through and seam the sleeve using single crochets. And we're just going to seam the sleeve all the way down. Once you have your seam all done, then you can go ahead and weave in these loose ends. Okay, so now we're going to turn this right side out. We're going to take our sweater and turn that right side in so that the ugly side is on the outside. And we're going to take our sleeve and locate the seam. This seam is going to go in the armpit. Place your sleeve into the sweater with right sides together, and then line up the side seam with the seam on the sleeve. So we're going to seam the sleeve to the sweater just like we did for all of the other seams. And if this is your first sleeve, go ahead and repeat this process to make your second sleeve. They're exactly the same. Okay, so once you have both of your sleeves attached, if you are making this sweater and you want it to be as close to the movie version as possible, then you're done here. So in the movie version, the ends, the edges, and the seams are all unfinished, so you get this kind of curling effect on all of them. So yeah, on the Weasley sweaters that everybody wears in the movies, all of the edges are unfinished. So this is kind of what it looks like. However, if you're like me and you prefer sweaters with ribbing and finished edges, then you can go ahead and do this next part. So yeah, again, if you want it to be as authentic as possible to the movie, you're all done here. If you want some ribbing, kind of like I have on my sweater here, along the sleeves, along the bottom, and then some finishing on the neck, then you can go ahead and follow along with the rest of this. If you want to have this be a little bit more finished than it is, the first thing we need to do is do a round of single crochets around the neckline. And we're going to do all of this with our smaller size hook because it's going to kind of help bring everything in. So I like to start just behind the shoulder seam. So we're going to pull our yarn through and chain one to secure it in place. And then we're going to go through and do one single crochet in every stitch around. And then once we get to the shoulder seam, we're actually going to do a decrease to help us bridge the gap. So I've got this stitch on this side and the stitch on this side. I'm just going to go through and pull up a loop and then cross over the seam into the stitch on the other side and pull up a loop, then yarn over and pull through all of the loops to decrease them together. And that just kind of helps us bridge the gap over the seam at the shoulder. And then we carry on just doing regular single crochets until we reach the next seam. And then once we reach the next seam, we're going to do another decrease. And now we are at the end of our round, so we can slip stitch. Yes, we could slip stitch and chain one to finish off. And then you can weave your yarn tail in. Okay, so that's the neck all finished off. And next, we're going to add some ribbing to the sleeves and to the bottom. So to make our ribbing, this is worked in very short rows. We're making a long ribbon of short rows. So the first thing we need to do is a few chains. Now, for me, this is a sweater for a child, so my ribbing is going to be a little bit more narrow. But if you want kind of a thicker, more substantial ribbing, you can do more chains. For me, I'm going to chain 5. But if you want a thicker ribbing, you can chain 8 or 10. It's up to you. So I've got my 5 here. And now I'm going to go back and I'm going to do one single crochet in every chain. Now we're going to chain 1 and turn. And from here on out, we're going to do back loop single crochet. So instead of going through both loops and doing a full single crochet, we are just going to go through the back loop only. Pull up a loop, yarn over, and single crochet. And we're going to do that in every stitch. And now I chain 1 and turn, and we'll do one more row together. So in the back loop, do 1 back loop single crochet in every stitch across. So you can see this is worked in very short rows. And then we work a lot of short rows and it builds it out over time. Now the number of rows you need is the number of stitches in the portion that you're doing the ribbing for. So for example, my sleeves, the base of my sleeves for this sweater are 25 stitches long. So I'm going to do 25 rows of ribbing. So right now I have 1, 2, 3, I think I'm on my 4th row. And your foundation row counts, as one of your rows. So I've got 1, 2, 3, yeah, I'm on my 4th row. I'm just going to chain 1 and turn and do rows of back loop single crochets until I have the same number of rows as I do stitches for the portion that I am making ribbing for. So the front and back panel of my sweater each has 43 stitches. So I'm going to do 2 sections of ribbing with 43 rows. And then my sleeves have 25 stitches each. So I'm going to do 2 lengths of ribbing that are 25 rows. And then once those are all made, I will show you how to attach them. Okay, so once you have the number of rows you need for your ribbing, we are actually going to sew this in place. We're not going to single crochet it into place. So you can chain 1 to finish off and then pull a little bit of a tail so that you've got enough to sew it into place. Darn your tapestry needle. And I like to start at the seam so that the seam for the ribbing and the seam for the sleeve line up. And we're just going to go through and with a whip stitch, secure this into place. So for every stitch, there is a row of ribbing. So I have 25 stitches on my sleeve, as well as 25 rows in my ribbing. You will have to stretch it a little bit to get it to go where you want it to go, because the ribbing is meant to be slightly smaller than the stitches in the sleeve. But yeah, just secure it in place using a whip stitch all the way around. And then once you get to the end, you can go ahead and sew it together. Also using a whip stitch, you can turn it inside out if you want, but if you do it, with the rights or with the wrong sides facing together, that's fine too. Like, it's not going to be a huge deal. It's not going to be super noticeable or anything like that. So no biggie. And then once it's all sewn into place, I like to just kind of tie a knot to secure it into place and then weave in my ends. Okay, so that's the ribbing for the cuff. So you can go ahead and make the rest of the ribbing, do the ribbing for your other sleeve as well as the front and back panels. Now I always crochet the ribbing for the front and back panels like separately. So a ribbon for the front and then a portion for the back, and then sew them together at the seams. So that's usually how I do that. But if you just want to make one big long one that can go all the way around, you can do that too. That's up to you. But once you have all that done, then you will be all done with your sweater.
Now, I made this sweater for my 4-year-old who insisted she wanted one. But because all 4-year-olds are turds, she refused to even put it on over her head. So here's my 6-year-old modeling her sweater. Turds. All 4-year-olds are turds. Merry Christmas.